The winter sky over Germany in early 1944 was a dull, metallic gray. A group of Luftwaffe scientists gathered on a snow-covered airfield near Rechlin, the nerve center of Nazi aviation testing. On the ground before them lay the twisted wreckage of something unfamiliar. Silver aluminum fragments, sleek, almost elegant, and unlike anything they had seen before. One of them, a tall man in a black overcoat, bent down and picked up a dented metal cylinder. It looked like a fuel tank, but it was made of something strange, thin, almost fragile, and yet it had survived the fall. He turned it in his hands, his breath freezing in the air, and muttered to himself, "How in God's name did they reach Berlin and come back?" That question, quiet and almost rhetorical, would haunt the Luftwaffe for months. A few hours earlier, the skies above Germany had been burning. Hundreds of American bombers, B-17 Flying Fortresses, and B-24 Liberators were pressing deep into the heart of the Reich. They had done this before, and usually the outcome was tragic. Formations decimated, crews lost, missions aborted. But this time, something was different. For the first time, the bombers had company, a new kind of escort fighter, sleek and long-ranged, with wings that shimmered in sunlight and a distinctive howl when it dived. It wasn't supposed to be there. No fighter could fly from England to Berlin and back. That was a fact every German ace knew by heart. And yet, the P-51 Mustang was doing exactly that. In the cockpit of one of those Mustangs, Lieutenant William Bill Overstreet Jr. gritted his teeth as tracers streaked past his canopy. A Messerschmitt Bf 109 dove at him from above, guns flashing. Overstreet rolled his Mustang onto its back, flying inverted just feet above the rooftops of Berlin. The German pilot followed. And that's when Overstreet pulled a maneuver so insane that even his squad mates thought it suicidal. He dove under a bridge, upside down, and came out on the other side, guns blazing. The Messerschmitt clipped the bridge and exploded in a ball of fire. Overstreet pulled up, heart pounding, fuel almost gone, and turned west. He didn't just make it home. He made it back to England. That was the day the Germans realized something impossible was happening. When word reached the German research offices, disbelief turned into alarm. Engineers were summoned, fragments collected, and captured parts of this mysterious, new American fighter were delivered to labs for analysis. Among them, those strange cylindrical containers, fuel drop tanks, became an obsession. Made from lightweight aluminum alloy and even paper-based composites, they looked crude at first glance. But their purpose was revolutionary. They were the reason the Mustang could now fly where no Allied fighter had ever reached and return. The Luftwaffe had underestimated American ingenuity. Until that winter, the air war over Germany had been predictable. Bombers came, fighters defended, and both sides accepted the limits of range and endurance. But then, seemingly overnight, those limits vanished. The Germans called it a miracle of fuel, an engineering trick that rewrote the rules of aerial warfare. As technicians cut open one of the recovered tanks, they discovered its simplicity and its genius. The tank wasn't designed to last. It was designed to be expendable. Once the Mustang reached its target zone, the pilot would jettison the tanks, freeing his aircraft for combat. That meant the P-51 could take off from England, escort bombers across Europe, engage the enemy over Berlin, and still have enough fuel to return. It changed everything, not just tactics, but the psychology of air war itself. For the first time, American pilots felt they could strike anywhere, anytime, without the dread of running out of sky. But in 1944, the Germans didn't know all that yet. They only knew that something fundamental had shifted. Their radar operators reported strange blips at ranges once thought unreachable. Pilots who engaged Mustangs near Leipzig swore those same aircraft pursued them all the way back to the North Sea. Commanders called it impossible. But the evidence, burning oil fields, downed interceptors, shattered refineries, was impossible to ignore. As the Reich reeled from the relentless bombing campaigns, questions began to circulate at the highest levels. Who built this aircraft? How could it outfly everything they had, even the vaunted FW-190? And what were those strange, detachable tanks, light as paper, that somehow made the impossible possible? In one smoky conference room, a senior Luftwaffe analyst laid out the evidence: the flight path of the bombers, the fuel calculations, the newly found American tanks. Then he uttered the chilling realization that would echo through every German airbase: they've solved range. The room fell silent. In that silence, everyone knew the war for the skies had just changed forever. Because with the arrival of the P-51 Mustang, the hunters had become the hunted. And the question haunting every German officer was no longer if Berlin would burn, but how soon. Before the Mustang became the terror of the skies, the Allied air war over Europe was a story of courage constantly colliding with cold mathematics. In 1942 and 1943, the United States Army Air Forces believed in a doctrine of daylight precision bombing, the idea that tightly packed formations of bombers, armed with machine guns and guided by Norden bomb sights, could strike key industrial targets with minimal escort. It was a theory born in classrooms and war rooms, and tested, fatally, in the freezing skies above Germany. The flying fortresses, the B-17s, were magnificent machines, powerful, rugged, capable of absorbing brutal punishment, and still limping home. Their 4 engines roared with confidence, their crews trusted in discipline, and their gunners formed a steel cocoon of defensive fire. But their greatest weakness wasn't in the guns or armor. It was in the distance between England and Germany. The problem of range was merciless. Once the bombers crossed deep into enemy territory, beyond the protective reach of British Spitfires and the heavy, short-ranged American P-47 Thunderbolts, they became easy prey. German radar stations spotted them hundreds of kilometers away. Luftwaffe squadrons scrambled from bases across France, the Low Countries, and Germany itself. Bf-109s and FW-190s climbed into the sun, forming deadly swarms waiting for the lumbering bombers to arrive. Then the slaughter began. The missions to Schweinfurt and Regensburg in 1943 became symbols of that grim reality. Hundreds of B-17s launched from England, loaded with bombs meant to cripple Germany's ball-bearing factories and aircraft production lines. But as they crossed the Rhine, their escorts had to turn back. What followed was a massacre. Dozens of fortresses were torn apart by cannon fire. Crewmen froze in open skies as their planes spiraled down in flames. Nearly 1 in 5 aircraft never returned. The airmen who survived called it the blackest day of the 8th Air Force. Every failure forced a question the Allied command had no answer for. How do you fight an enemy who always knows where you can't go? The Luftwaffe exploited this weakness with ruthless efficiency. Their aces, men like Adolf Galland, Egon Meyer, and Walter Dahl, learned to strike the bombers at their most vulnerable moments, They would attack from the front, where the defensive fire was weakest, then dive through the formation, scattering the enemy's tight defensive box. Meyer perfected the head-on attack, firing 20-millimeter cannons straight into the bombers' noses before they could react. Every engagement was a lesson written in blood. On the Allied side, desperation grew. Engineers tried stretching the range of the P-47 Thunderbolt by fitting it with external fuel tanks, metal drums that gave it a few dozen extra minutes of flight. But those tanks were heavy, expensive, and cumbersome. The RAF's Spitfires, though brilliant dogfighters, could barely cross the channel with enough fuel for a single engagement. The American command needed something that didn't yet exist: a high-performance fighter with the endurance of a bomber and the agility of a racer. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, engineers at North American Aviation were working on a design no one had asked for. In just 117 days, led by Edgar Schmood and Lee Atwood, they built a sleek prototype around a revolutionary airframe, the NA-73X. It was aerodynamic, elegant, and fast. But its first versions were underpowered, fitted with Allison engines that lost performance at high altitude. To the RAF, it was a curiosity, useful for reconnaissance maybe, but not a war winner. Then came the miracle of collaboration. British engineers suggested installing the Rolls-Royce Merlin, the same engine that powered the Spitfire and Lancaster bomber. When the first Merlin-powered Mustang took to the air in 1943, the transformation was instantaneous. Its performance leapt off the charts. It could climb faster, fly higher, and, most importantly, stay in the air far longer than any other fighter in the war. At 400 miles per hour, and with a range that could stretch beyond 1,600 miles, the P-51 was suddenly something entirely new, a fighter that could escort bombers to Berlin and back. But in the beginning, few believed it would change everything. Generals doubted its durability. Pilots, used to the rugged P-47, were skeptical of its slender frame. Even the British were unsure if its long-range promise was real or just a mathematical dream. Still, test pilots reported something magical. It flies like a Spitfire, but all the way to Germany. By late 1943, the first Mustang squadrons joined the 8th Air Force in England. They were fast, aggressive, and stunningly beautiful, polished aluminum reflecting the winter sun. The Luftwaffe didn't take them seriously at first. To the German aces, they were just another Allied plane, one more enemy target in an endless war of attrition. That illusion would not last long, because soon the P-51s would begin flying deeper, farther, and longer than anyone thought possible. And when they returned home with half their fuel still intact, the Germans would ask the question that started this story. How did they do it? By the end of 1943, the air war over Europe had turned into a grim equation of sacrifice. Every mission seemed to cost more than it gained. The Allied command still clung to the idea that sheer courage could overcome physics, that waves of bombers could carve their way to the heart of Germany through discipline and determination alone. But courage, it turned out, could not outfly a Messerschmitt. The missions to Bremen, Hamburg, and Hanover read like chapters from a tragic ledger. Dozens of bombers went out, half returned. Crews joked bitterly that if you survived 25 missions, you earned a ticket home. But few ever reached that number. Gunners' gloves froze to their turrets at 30,000 feet. Frostbite and fire were constant companions. Inside the formations, men counted not minutes, but heartbeats between attacks. The Luftwaffe came in waves, elegant predators against lumbering prey. For the Germans, the strategy was brutal in its simplicity. Let the bombers come, exhaust their fuel, then destroy them before they could reach home. Luftwaffe radar plotted their courses like clockwork. Squadrons of FW-190s would rise to meet them near the Rhine, Bf-110s with heavy cannons followed, and high above them, the elite Jagdgeschwader, fighter wings led by aces like Galland and Barkhorn, waited to dive into the killing zone. When the escorts turned back, the Germans closed in. American commanders called these deep penetration missions. The crews called them suicide runs. One December morning during the raid on Münster, Major James Howard of the 354th Fighter Group watched in horror as an entire formation of B-17s disintegrated in midair. He was flying one of the early P-51 Mustangs, still experimental, still unproven. The sky ahead was a nightmare of smoke trails, burning aluminum, and black flak bursts. Howard realized that if the bombers were to survive, something had to change, and fast. But change came slowly. On the ground, arguments raged inside the halls of the 8th Air Force headquarters in High Wycombe. Generals demanded results, engineers demanded patience, the British pushed for night bombing, the Americans insisted on daylight raids. Both sides were right, and both were losing. "We're sending boys to die with courage as their only armor," one colonel muttered during a meeting. "And courage runs out faster than fuel." Meanwhile, morale was collapsing. Crews joked about flying coffins and painted Grim Reapers on their fuselages. A tail gunner from the 100th Bomb Group, the Bloody 100th, wrote in his diary, "Every mission feels like walking into an empty grave and hoping someone else falls in first." The Luftwaffe, too, felt the strain, but theirs was the exhaustion of predators overfed. Fuel shortages grew, and the endless Allied raids tested their endurance. Still, in 1943, the Germans owned the sky. They believed it would always be that way. The Americans tried extending their escorts with the P-38 Lightning, a twin-boom, twin-engine fighter famed for its speed and altitude. But the Lightning was temperamental, prone to engine failures in Europe's cold, damp air. The P-47 Thunderbolt remained a powerhouse, but its fuel thirst was insatiable. Even with drop tanks, it could only escort bombers part way before turning back, leaving the fortresses alone in enemy skies. And that was when the slaughter began again. The January raid on Oschersleben became another symbol of futility. 230 B-17s set out. 34 were shot down. The survivors limped back with shredded wings and half-dead crews. Debriefing officers stopped asking about mission success. They asked how many parachutes had been seen. The answer was always the same: too many. Behind the statistics was a deeper crisis, one of faith. The entire doctrine of strategic bombing was being questioned. Could the Allies really destroy Germany from the air without controlling the skies? General Ira Eaker, commander of the 8th Air Force, faced mounting pressure from Washington. The British urged him to reconsider. "We can't keep sending them without proper escort," said one RAF liaison officer. "You're fighting with courage against mathematics, and mathematics always wins." That was when the whispers began about a new aircraft, one that might finally break the cycle. Pilots returning from North American test flights spoke of an American-built machine that could fly to the target, fight, and still make it home. The P-51 Mustang was its name. But to the men risking their lives daily, It sounded like another fantasy. Until they saw it. In early 1944, as bomber losses reached unbearable levels, the first Mustangs began arriving in combat squadrons. The pilots who climbed into them noticed something strange. It just felt different. Sleek, balanced, built for endurance. Still, few believed it could change the war overnight. But the ground crews noticed something else. The long, slender fuel tanks bolted under its wings. They looked almost fragile, light enough to dent with a hammer. Men laughed, calling them tin cans with wings. Yet those tin cans held the answer to the deadliest riddle of the air war. Because inside those thin aluminum skins was not just fuel, but the future. And within months, those drop tanks would carry the Mustangs farther than any fighter had ever gone, straight into the heart of the Reich. When the first P-51 Mustangs began escorting bombers deep into German airspace in early 1944, no one, not even the Americans, fully grasped what had just begun. For months, Allied intelligence officers had argued that long-range escort was a mathematical impossibility. The Luftwaffe believed the same. But then, from the pale February skies over Leipzig and Brunswick, came the first shockwave of a new era. Hundreds of bombers appearing over Germany, and this time, they weren't alone. It started as a rumor in the Luftwaffe's forward bases. Pilots returning from sorties spoke in disbelief of new American fighters, still following them hundreds of kilometers from the front. Impossible, said their commanders. No single-engine plane can fly that far. But the evidence kept coming. Shot-down German aircraft found hundreds of miles from the front lines, with 50-caliber holes stitched through their fuselages, the signature of Mustang fire. The secret, of course, was those strange, lightweight external tanks hanging beneath the P-51's wings. American engineers had done something audacious. They accepted weakness to gain strength. The tanks were made of thin aluminum, later even paper and resin, so fragile they could be punctured with a screwdriver. But they didn't need to last. They only had to feed the Mustang's hungry Merlin engine until it reached the battle zone. Then the pilot would flip a switch, and the tanks would drop away, fluttering into the clouds like falling leaves. Freed from their weight, the Mustang transformed from long-range escort to lethal dogfighter in an instant. The effect was electric. Suddenly, the Luftwaffe's greatest advantage, the certainty that the bombers would eventually be left unprotected, vanished overnight. Now the hunters found themselves hunted. The first true test came on March 4th, 1944. The target, Berlin. It was supposed to be a symbolic strike, a message that the Allies could reach the very heart of Nazi power. Until that day, every attempt to bomb the capital had ended in disaster. But that morning, as formations of B-17s roared eastward, the Luftwaffe prepared as usual, confident that the American escorts would turn back over the Rhine. They didn't. When radar picked up new contacts over Magdeburg, small, fast, closing rapidly, German controllers assumed they were local defenders. They were wrong. They were Mustangs. From the ground, witnesses described it as a sudden reversal of gravity. The P-51s dove into the German formations with terrifying precision. Their 6 Browning 50s tore through the sky, catching the FW-190s in shock. Luftwaffe pilots, who had spent years dictating the terms of air combat, now found themselves on the defensive, chased across their own skies. One pilot radioed in panic, "Sie sind überall. They are everywhere." For the first time in the war, the Luftwaffe could not escape its own airspace. In London, the news electrified Allied command. The impossible had been done. General James Doolittle, recently placed in charge of the 8th Air Force, saw the opportunity and made a radical decision that changed everything. The escorts would no longer stay tied to the bomber formations. Instead, he ordered Mustang groups to roam freely ahead of the bombers, hunting down the Luftwaffe before it could attack. It was a bold gamble, leaving the bombers momentarily exposed, but it unleashed chaos upon the German defense network. The Luftwaffe lost control of its timing. Every interception plan collapsed as P-51s appeared where they were never supposed to be. The pilots themselves became legends overnight. George Preddy, Don Gentile, John Godfrey. Names whispered with awe. They learned to exploit the Mustang's incredible agility, using vertical dives and rolling climbs that the heavier FW-190s couldn't match. One favorite tactic was the high cover trap. A flight of Mustangs would cruise invisibly above the bomber stream, then dive at 450 minutes weight into the unsuspecting interceptors. Seconds later, the sky would be filled with smoke and fire. The German command tried to adapt. They launched new high-altitude fighters, experimented with heavier armament, even called for the development of jet interceptors. But none of it mattered quickly enough. By April 1944, the Luftwaffe's veteran aces were dying faster than they could be replaced. Training schools turned out boys with barely 30 flight hours, thrown into the sky against battle-hardened Mustang pilots who had already tasted blood. In one of the most famous encounters, Lieutenant William Bill Overstreet, the same pilot who had once flown under a bridge in Paris, chased a Messerschmitt through a web of anti-aircraft fire and shot it down over the city. His fuel tanks had been empty for almost 10 minutes before the kill. When he landed in England, ground crews found bullet holes in his drop tanks, both long gone by then. "They kept me alive long enough," he said. "That's all they were built for." That was the paradox the Germans could not grasp when they studied the wreckage of captured Mustangs. The drop tanks looked disposable, crude even, but they embodied the very principle that had eluded the Luftwaffe for years. Freedom through sacrifice. By embracing simplicity, fuel first, finesse later, the Americans had created a fighter that transcended its limits. And so, as spring turned to summer, the skies above Germany changed color. What had once been the deep blue domain of the Luftwaffe now shimmered with the silver wings of Mustangs, sleek, predatory, endless. For the first time, American airmen could look down upon the Reich's heartland and know that no part of it was beyond reach. Berlin was no longer a dream. It was just another waypoint. By the summer of 1944, the skies over Europe no longer belonged to the Luftwaffe. They belonged to the long silver ghosts that came roaring out of the western horizon, the Mustangs. What began as a technical experiment in extending range had become a complete revolution in air warfare. Every mission, every flight, and every pilot carried the proof that the balance of power had irreversibly shifted. The first visible sign of that shift was statistical and terrifying for the Germans. In January 1944, the Luftwaffe had more than 2,000 operational fighters defending the Reich. By June, barely 700 remained airworthy. The rest had been destroyed in dogfights, on the ground, or in transit. The hunters of 1943 were now the hunted, shredded in their own airfields before they could even take off. Allied reconnaissance photos showed a pattern that spoke volumes: rows of burnt Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts. their wings blackened, their shadows long across the tarmac. The turning point was Big Week, February 20th, 1944. It was an all-out assault on the German aircraft industry. Hundreds of bombers struck factories in Leipzig, Gotha, and Augsburg, escorted by wave after wave of Mustangs. For the first time, the Allies didn't just bomb, they annihilated the Luftwaffe's capacity to fight back. German pilots called it Höllenwoche, Hell Week. Entire Jagdgeschwader squadrons were wiped out. Veterans who had once boasted hundreds of kills were replaced by cadets barely old enough to shave. On the ground, despair set in. At Rechlin, engineers who had once examined captured Mustang tanks now faced a bitter irony. They knew exactly how the Americans were doing it. But Germany no longer had the materials or fuel to copy them. Aluminum was scarce, synthetic rubber was stretched thin, and aviation fuel had become so precious that new pilots were sometimes trained using gliders. The Reich's technical genius could no longer overcome its collapsing supply lines. The war of ideas had been won by simplicity. Meanwhile, in the Allied command centers of southern England, confidence soared. Doolittle's new strategy, freeing the escorts to hunt independently, was proving devastating. Mustang pilots roamed ahead of bomber formations like wolves, sweeping the skies clean before the bombers arrived. In a single month, they destroyed more than 500 enemy aircraft. The psychological effect was immense. For the first time, bomber crews flew missions with a sense of safety. Not total, but real. When you saw the Mustangs above you, one B-17 navigator recalled, you felt like God had finally remembered your name. But the war was far from over. The Luftwaffe still struck back with ferocity whenever it could. Over Berlin, Hanover, and Kassel, fierce engagements turned the sky into a storm of contrails and fire. The Germans introduced new aircraft, the Me-163 Comet, a rocket-powered interceptor that could climb faster than anything on Earth, and the Me-262 Schwalbe, the world's first operational jet fighter. These machines were terrifying glimpses of the future, capable of outrunning any propeller-driven aircraft. But they came too late, and in too few numbers, to change the outcome. Even the jet pilots admitted defeat in spirit. "We were fighting ghosts," one Me-262 pilot wrote in his diary. "They appeared from nowhere, struck with impossible range, and vanished. We knew they came from England, but it felt like they came from another world." The Mustang didn't just protect bombers. It changed strategy itself. It allowed the Allies to choose their battles. With long-range cover, the 8th and 15th Air Forces could bomb oil refineries in Ploiești, rail yards in Vienna, and factories in central Germany, all within the same week. Each strike strangled the Reich a little more. Without fuel, the Luftwaffe's machines became monuments. Without air cover, German ground forces lost mobility and protection. And without those, the road to Normandy, and eventually Berlin, opened wide. But victory had its cost. Mustang pilots paid it in blood. The new range gave them freedom, but also isolation. Many never made it back. When a P-51 went down deep behind enemy lines, there was no hope of rescue. One squadron, the 357th Fighter Group, the Oxford Boys, lost dozens of pilots in just a few weeks of combat. They were brave, reckless, and often barely 20 years old. "They didn't think about dying," said one ground mechanic later. "They thought about getting one more kill before they ran out of sky." Still, the results were undeniable. By the time the Allies launched Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy, in June 1944, air superiority was complete. the Luftwaffe could barely muster a token defense. Every beachhead, every convoy, every tank rolling across France did so under the protective shadow of the Mustang's wings. From that moment forward, the Germans were fighting a war they could no longer win, not because they lacked courage, but because they had lost the sky. The P-51's drop tanks had stretched the reach of Allied air power beyond geography, beyond imagination. The Germans had laughed at the thought of an escort fighter reaching Berlin and back. Now, they were watching their capital burn under bombers that were never alone again. And somewhere, in a forgotten laboratory, a German scientist still held one of those fragile aluminum tanks in his hands, dented, discarded, yet world-changing. What seemed like scrap metal had rewritten the destiny of nations. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, Europe was a continent of ashes. Cities once alive with industry and light were now skeletons of steel and stone. Amid the ruins stood the symbols of both genius and destruction. The twisted fuselages of Messerschmitts, the shattered wings of Focke-Wulfs, and, scattered across airfields in England and France, rows of weathered P-51 Mustangs, their paint chipped, their propellers still. The war that had begun with biplanes and courage had ended with machines that bordered on science fiction. Jet propulsion, radar, and long-range flight had transformed warfare, but at a terrible cost. Every breakthrough came paid for in lives, in burned cities, in faces that would never grow old. The Mustang was no exception. It was born from necessity, refined by science, and perfected by the sacrifice of thousands. Historians often say that the P-51 was the machine that made victory inevitable. That's true, but incomplete. The real story lies in the quiet minds that saw beyond the limits of 1940. The engineers who refused to accept that range and speed were mutually exclusive. Men like Edgar Schmood, the German-born designer who emigrated to America and created the Mustang at North American Aviation. His vision fused aerodynamics and intuition, a laminar flow wing that sliced through air with unprecedented efficiency, a Merlin engine that sang in the upper atmosphere, and those drop tanks that defied the geography of war itself. It's a strange irony. The key to defeating Nazi Germany's air power came in part from a man who once walked its streets. Schmood never forgot that contradiction. After the war, he said quietly in an interview, "A good airplane doesn't ask who you are. It only asks, how far can you go?" That line, simple and haunting, could serve as the epitaph of the entire air war. For the Germans who had examined that mysterious drop tank years earlier, the Mustang remained both an object of awe and a wound to pride. In post-war archives, Allied interrogators recorded the disbelief of German engineers. One Luftwaffe officer wrote, "It was not the aircraft itself that surprised us. It was the range. We realized then that no corner of the Reich was beyond reach. It was the end of distance." The end of distance. That was the Mustang's true legacy. In a single generation, the world had grown smaller. What began as a military necessity to protect bombers over Europe became the blueprint for modern aviation. Every airliner, every long-range reconnaissance craft, every global mission that followed carried a trace of that same DNA. Efficiency, endurance, and elegance born from survival. But there was a human cost that no amount of engineering could erase. For every pilot who returned to base, another vanished in fire and smoke. Some disappeared over the channel. Others fell deep within occupied Europe, their names preserved only in squadron logs and fading photographs. At the American cemeteries in Normandy and Cambridge, rows of white crosses mark the price of that innovation. In the decades that followed, many surviving Mustang pilots became quiet men. They built families, businesses, and peaceful lives. But they never forgot the sound, that high, throaty roar of the Merlin engine at full climb. To them, it wasn't just a sound of power, but of deliverance. One veteran put it best. It wasn't the Mustang that won the war. It was the men who believed it could. Today, a few P-51s still fly. Restored, gleaming in sunlight, they carry names like Old Crow, Big Beautiful Doll, Glamorous Glenn III. When they pass overhead at air shows, people look up in wonder, not fear. Children point at them, those sleek silver birds, without knowing that once they were instruments of war, symbols of a world on fire. The Mustang has outlived the empire it helped defeat, the generals who commanded it, and even the idea of the war it fought. What remains is the idea that changed history, that innovation, even in its simplest form, a lightweight metal tank bolted beneath a wing, can alter the fate of nations. And somewhere in the silence after its engine fades, in the long echo above green fields and forgotten runways, you can almost hear the question that drove both the scientists and the pilots through years of war and loss.